Thank you very much, Louise, for your generous introduction. I want to thank a few people. First, Michael Weisberg, thank you very much for supporting this program, making it possible. Thank you, Louise Mirrer, President and CEO of the New York Historical. My great thanks to my wonderful editor at W.W. Norton, Julia Reedhead, who's also the president of Norton, and my agent, Ann Edelstein, my agent and longtime friend. They've all supported my work for many years, and I'm very grateful. My wife, Pamela Twigg, is here, and she has supported me in many ways. And as Louise said, today is the launch of a new book, which is a special thing for a writer. So thank you all very much for helping me to launch this book into a perilous world. So I'll talk for about 15 minutes. I'll give a kind of quick overview, and I'll use some images to keep you alert. And then Louise will join me here, and we'll have a conversation, and then we'll have time for as many questions as we can. That's the book cover. When the roots of this book go back 25 years for me to when I first met Charles Gehring and Jannie Venema, who were the translators of the official archive of the Dutch colony of New Netherland, working at the New York State Library in Albany. Charlie started that in 1974. This is 12,000 pages of official records, court cases, council minutes, correspondence. Charlie's, and you can see some examples of it there. Charlie started in 1974. Jannie joined him in 1984. Jannie retired a few years ago. Charlie is, believe it or not, still at it. And on the 15th of March, I'll be doing an event for this book in Albany that is also the farewell event for Charlie as he retires after 51 years on the job. So it's all due to them. Okay, so to get to the geography in question, I started with this image because I'm going to be talking a lot about Europeans, about the English and the Dutch, but I want to make clear that this landscape was already intricately peopled at the time the Europeans arrived here. And this looks complicated, but in fact, the reality was much more complicated than this. This is really oversimplified. For example, the Montauk were not the only people on Long Island. There were many, including the Shinnecock and others. But just to make it a little bit more comprehensible, I'll simplify even further and say that the Dutch and then the English had complex dealings with many of the native peoples, which involved learning languages and customs and so on. And the principal ones being the Mohican further north up the Hudson River, and then to their west, the 5 nations of the Iroquois or Haudenosaunee, and they were the people with whom they traded for furs, which was the initial business. And then also, particularly pertinent to this story, the Delaware. In the Delaware, also called the Munsee or Lenape, were the people in and around what's now the New York City region. That's essentially the same geography with that little orange loop showing you what was the Dutch colony of New Netherland, which encompassed all or parts of New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Delaware, and some of Pennsylvania. I'm using a couple of slides here. Last year we had an exhibit here at the New York Historical called New York Before New York, the Costello Plan of New Amsterdam, and we had some very special objects on loan. This is the Costello Plan, which is on loan from the Biblioteca Lorenziana in Florence, in Italy. It is a map. It's a bird's eye map of New Amsterdam. It's pointed, so the left is south. That's the tip of Manhattan Island. And today, this is the financial district. That's New Amsterdam, 16 streets, about 300 houses. They were Dutch, so they had to have a couple of canals in there. They had a windmill or two. So that's one area where this story takes place. Another item that we had is the Peter Schagen letter. There was a deed the Dutch negotiated with the Lenape people, which has been lost. This is the next best thing. So when the next ship returned to Europe, a government official listened to the people on the ship and then reported to his bosses saying, our people have purchased the island of Manhattan from the native people. And if you can see about 6 lines down on the left side, you can kind of read it, Island Manhattan. This illustration by an artist named Johannes Vingbones is of New Amsterdam right at the moment of takeover. And in fact, if you look across the top, it says New Amsterdam or now New York on the island of Manhattan. So it's like, you know, the artist finished and then someone must have reported this change of name. So he kind of indicated that. So that's almost like a snapshot of the period that I'm talking about here. This is a map of the region created by the Dutch in the period. I could talk for an hour about this map, but I won't. But it's the same geography. It was used, this map was used for about 100 years. It was the most accurate map of this section of North America. New York Historical has 11 different states of it. There were 28 different versions of it made. And very briefly, this slide is to remind me to make the point that this is not a simple story. It's a story of 3 cultures, Dutch, African, and Native American. On the left side, you see a basket and then the contents of the basket that were unearthed in New Amsterdam in the 1980s. That is called an umpungu. It's an African ritual healing collection. The portrait of the man in the middle is thought to be of a Lenape warrior who was captured during what was called Kieft's War. And then that's an image of a longhouse village. And even saying 3 cultures is not enough, because Dutch, there were more than 18 languages spoken in New Amsterdam. So it was under Dutch auspices, but it was a very mixed place. African, there were at least 3 African languages being spoken. And Native American, as I said, it was very complex. Okay, these are the 2 protagonists, I guess you would say, of the story. Well, I'm kind of lying. On the right is Peter Stuyvesant. This is the portrait that is in the New York Historical Collection. On the left, we don't have, I looked so hard, we don't have an image of Richard Nicolls, the man who came to butt heads with Stuyvesant in the summer of 1664. This is a man named George Goring, who I'm telling you right now, that's not actually Nicolls, it's Goring. I'm putting him there so you have someone to, some kind of face. So Goring was, he was almost exactly Nicolls' age. Like Nicolls, he was a colonel in the Royalist, on the Royalist side in the English Civil War. And we have a physical description of Nicolls, and he sort of matches that. So, okay, so on the English side of this story, it's really the main thing to keep in your mind is that England was torn apart and had a serious identity crisis in the course of the 17th century. The Puritans, who essentially were religious extremists who wanted to take control of the government, and Royalists is a bit of a misnomer because it basically means everyone who didn't want the Puritans to take over. So they fought a vicious civil war. On the right, you can see that image from the time of the beheading of the King Charles I. And then the man in the middle, Oliver Cromwell, takes charge and the Puritan rule begins. At the end of the Civil War, so after the beheading, Charles's 2 sons, the princes, Charles and James, flee to the continent and go into exile. Richard Nicolls, whose portrait you did not see, had known them from birth. His father, Nicolls' father, was the keeper of a hunting grounds that the king who would be beheaded would come to every year and bring his sons. So this man, Nicolls, grew up with the 2 Stuart princes. Then in 1660, the princes come back across the channel, the monarchy is restored. Almost the first thing so they set up several societies. They set up a council for foreign plantations whose purpose was to begin colonizing. This was a great era in which Europe was colonizing parts of the world. So they're thinking about empire. They also set up a royal society, which is still maybe the world's premier society for the advancement of science. And they look across the Atlantic and they want to organize. And, oops. I inserted this slide in here just to give you a quick sense of doing some of the primary source material on this, for this book. in research I was doing at Oxford University, the Bodleian Library. While the royal princes were in exile, there was this group of men organized around them called the Sealed Knot. And they were scheming, they were spies, and they were scheming to get them back on the throne. Richard Nicolls was one of them. So I found this among the papers of the Duke of Clarendon, who became sort of the most important man in the Stuart government. And if you look sort of down here, you can see the numerals of the cipher. This is a note in cipher, and then the receiver deciphered it up above. And you can see it says Nicolls, and down on the next line, arrived safe. So, so that's a little bit of, these finding pieces, puzzle pieces, and then slowly fitting them together to track this man in his time with the Stuarts in exile. Okay, now what I was starting to say a minute ago was, they're back on the throne now, and they look across the Atlantic, and they want to organize things. And this is what they see. So you see New England, those are the English colonies to the north. And then down all the way to the south, you see Maryland and Virginia, which are nascent English colonies. In between is this Dutch colony occupying, annoyingly occupying the whole center of the eastern seaboard. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is the New England colonies were founded by the Puritans, the people who beheaded the king's father and continue to give them trouble. So they send Richard Nicolls here on a two-part mission. One part was to take control of the Dutch colony, and he came armed to the teeth with 4 ships loaded with soldiers and weapons. And the other part was to sail to New England and make the Puritans toe the line, make them understand that they are part of this government and this growing empire. Okay, this is the geography of the story that I tell in the book, Taking Manhattan. This is New York Harbor. I think that image is a little squished there, but you can see New Amsterdam there at the tip of Manhattan Island. You see that those arrows pointing to Dutch towns that were settled on Long Island, Vlissingen or Flushing, Breukelen or Brooklyn, Vlakkebos, which became Flatbush, New Utrecht, New Amersfoort, and then Gravesend. Gravesend is different because Gravesend was settled by England, within New Netherland, but it was settled by English. A woman named Lady Deborah Moody had fled religious persecution in England, fled to New England, and was persecuted there because she wasn't in fact a Puritan, and the Dutch said, come and settle here. So that became an English settlement within the Dutch colony. So Richard Nicolls, when he sails here with his flotilla of warships, that's where he goes first. He doesn't go right to Manhattan, he goes there. And what transpires then is the stuff of this book. That's the story that I tell in this book. So Nicolls is based there in Gravesend, his ship at anchor, and he's sending small boats with messengers to Peter Stuyvesant in New Amsterdam. And Stuyvesant sends messengers back. And it's this very ornate protocol being honored. They are sussing each other out. And what they're doing is they're coming to understand what they both already felt, because they knew this history quite well, which is these English, meaning the English who were part of, who were the non-Puritans, the anti-Puritans, the Royalists, who founded the Royal Society and so on, they are relatively tolerant. They're in favor of religious toleration. They are practical and pragmatic. And the Dutch are saying, they're kind of like us. The Dutch, meanwhile, had been trying for years to get their home country to support them. They had been saying, look, we have this colony here, and we've got this great continent we can exploit, and the English are encroaching. You have to send reinforcements, and they were rebuffed time and again. So they came in this 2-week period in August and early September of 1664, and this is basically what I come to in the book. These two sides hashed out a deal. And you couldn't, Richard Nicolls couldn't wire home or text home or anything like that. He just decided, rather than blow the place to smithereens, he was going to make an offer. And this is what they ended up with, which is sometimes called articles of surrender. But there's nothing in here that says the settlers here have to give up their arms or anything. in fact, it's a Bill of Rights. It promises that they will be free denizens, they'll enjoy their lands, they'll keep their goods, they'll keep their, most importantly, they'll keep their trade networks. These were traders who had networks in the Caribbean, in South America, in West Africa, in Europe. People may continue to come here from the Netherlands, and Dutch vessels can come and go. You'll enjoy liberty of conscience. So this then establishes this really interesting, as I call it in the book, a merger of these two uprising powers in Europe. So what the Dutch gave up was actual control of the colony. It would transfer to the English. But what they kept was essentially everything else. And that, I think, is a recipe for New York to grow as it did. Shortly after Nicolls, after this is in effect, Nicolls becomes the first governor of New York. And he then, I found this letter he wrote to the James, the Duke of York, and in which he almost, by the way, says, oh, I gave to this place the name New York. So he also named it on the ground. And this map is really less of a map because it's not very useful as a map. It's more like a trophy that they did and sent to the Duke of York. And this is the town of New Amsterdam, which became New York. Nicolls also had this map commissioned. And again, this image is a little squished, but it's the island of Manhattan. You can see they were sending this to people in Europe who didn't have an understanding of the geography, so they're helpfully saying part of the continent of America, and then up top, part of Long Island. And you can see the inset view all the way at the tip of the island. The inset view is of the town of New York. And the rest of it, as you can see, the rest of Manhattan is except for all the way up on the left there, is New Harlem. But for the most part, it's wilderness in this period. Jumping now, this image is in the 19th century. So I'm just quickly making the points here that this agreement was not a military takeover, but more of a merger. And the city would remain Dutch, multi-ethnic, relatively tolerant, free trading. People would keep their homes, and Dutch people continued coming. But it would have a new name. And the last point I'm going to make is Nicolls' other mission, to go to the Puritans in New England and get them to toe the line. He failed utterly. And these are, I'm not going to go through all that, but these are quotes from Nicolls sent a commission repeatedly to New England to get especially the Puritan leaders in Boston to agree that, yes, they would abide by the king. And so these are quotes of what they did to Quaker and others who were non-Puritans. They have been beaten to jelly, and in other ways exceeding cruel. They misconstrued the king's letters. So the Puritans just thumbed their noses at them. And that sets up a dynamic in American history. So you have one ideology in New York, which is tolerant, multi-ethnic, pragmatic, globally minded, and the other centered in Boston, which sees America as the promised land, and they are the chosen ones, and it's God's country. And those two ideologies, I think, would echo out across the American centuries. It's always nice to end with a sort of before and after. Is this the Ving bones? You can, with a little just a little tinkering, you can superimpose it on the financial district and get a sense of what it became. All right, I'm going to invite Louise to join me on the stage, and we'll have a little conversation. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Russell. It's always wonderful to see maps. We have lots of them in our collection, yeah. But Russell ferreted out some additional ones for the wonderful exhibition that we did, which I hope many of you were able to see, New York Before New York. Yeah. So it was basically 20 years ago that Russell first came into my consciousness and the consciousness of the New York Historical with the publication of Island at the Center of the World. I think maybe it was your first book talk that you did here. Ann Edelstein, whom I had known for many years, called me up and said, you know, what do you think about having a book talk for Russell Shorto I'm his agent. He just wrote this fabulous new book. And indeed, Russell did a book talk, and we did a really lovely celebration. So, and I think many of you here this evening have surely read Island at the Center of the World, and it's probably motivated you to come for what maybe you're thinking is the sequel. So is this book the sequel?
Is it a sequel? I suppose in a way. It's the Island at the Center of the World tells the story of the Dutch settlement, and this zeroes in on the moment of the English takeover. So it zeroes in on sort of the last few pages of that book. And the reason I came to do this is, as I said at the outset, it was through the work of Charlie Gehring and Yanni Venema and their translations that I originally came to write Island at the Center of the World. They have continued to do their work, and in recent years, they've moved near to the end. So we see the last few years in the life of the colony. We get this rich picture of what was going on, and we can see it as this very vibrant place. And we can see it more or less the way Richard Nicolls would have seen it when he sailed into the harbor, and what would have attracted him. So that's why I thought, let's zero in on that moment.
So let's just talk a little bit more about Manhattan. How did Manhattan get its name in the first place? And
that's a native word, and the best guess, there are several theories, but the best guess is by a man named Ives Goddard that it means something like a place where we get wood for bows.
So what were they doing in Manhattan when the Dutch arrived?
The native people?
Mm-hmm.
It was, I think, mostly used seasonally for hunting. Mm-hmm. The excavations of native sites, I think, they're not permanent settlements. So that was used, and as I said, the Lenape people were the people, generally speaking, of this region. But my understanding is that it was not only used by them. The Shinnecock used it, for example. So it would have been, you think of New York as the World Trade Center. I think in a way it was, even before Europeans arrived, that you had many different native peoples using this piece of land in this area.
And what were they hunting?
Hunting, fish. What kind of animals? On Manhattan there were bear, deer. In the water there were beavers, otters, porpoises and whales. It was a very rich and stands of oak and I can't think of the name of that big tree, buttonwood I want to say, but it's all sycamore. That's the word, sycamore.
Very, very different Manhattan from the city, the borough that we know today, for sure. So, so tell us a little bit about why Manhattan was so appealing and why it was, coveted by the Dutch and later by the English.
The Dutch were a seafaring people, and they had built this empire, this global empire, before the English did. So the Dutch and English were great rivals, but the Dutch were ahead of them, which caused the English to really envy them. So the Dutch, when they came to this area, and ironically it was an Englishman, Henry Hudson, who sailed on behalf of the Dutch and charted the area, they looked at the land in terms of water, because water was access. Waterways were the highways. So here's Manhattan Island in this world-class harbor with this river, the Hudson River, that cuts deep into the continent, and then about 150 miles up, the Mohawk River goes west all the way to the Great Lakes. So there were people in the Dutch period who had gotten a sense from the native people that that's the future. If you want, what the Dutch were trying to say to their home country was, look at this. We sort of have this all mapped out. Look what we could do to exploit this. And if you jump ahead to the 1820s, when the Erie Canal is completed, which makes the Mohawk River navigable all the way, suddenly the cities around the Duluth and Detroit and Chicago, all those cities, Erie, come into being, and then the cities at the confluence of those two rivers, Troy and Schenectady and Albany, become these gritty, up-and-coming towns, and New York City takes off as this fulcrum between where all the world's commerce can come into this harbor and then be processed, and as well as people, settlers, can come and go into the heart of the continent. And there were people in the Dutch colony who envisioned that, and in fact it came true, just not under their auspices.
Oh. So those of you who will read Russell's new book will encounter a very dramatic beginning. There's Richard Nicolls, who's sort of approaching Manhattan, eyeing it, sort of, scoping it out, checking it out. How did you come across Richard Nicolls in the first instance? I mentioned to Russell just before that I was looking at some very old records of the New York Historical and discovered that actually in 1809, at one of the formal St. Nicholas Day celebrations at the New York Historical, which happened every year and was a very big deal, and there were multiple toasts. One of the toasts was to Peter Stuyvesant, the Dutch governor of the city, and the next one was to Richard Nicolls, the English governor.
Nicolls is, as you point out, Nicolls is known, and every, for example, Gotham, the big book on New York history, Nicolls plays a role there. Most histories of New York devote the same few sentences, same few facts to Nicolls, and then they move into what was the rest of the history in the English period. And once I decided I was going to try to zero in on this 2-week period and what was, what transpired, because it shifts from this. I mean, there were several times they were about to open fire on one another, but they stood down and instead they behaved like adults. So once I decided I was going to focus on that, I wanted to know more about Nicolls beyond what the few facts people repeated. So we took a family vacation to the little town of Ampthill in Bedfordshire, which is where he was born and raised, and where the Stuarts would come for hunting. And we got a tour there from this lovely man who's the town historian, and Nicolls' grave is there. He was buried there. And on his grave, there's a British flag and an American flag. So the people in this town, anyway, remember him. And then, doing this research at Oxford and at Kew, at the British National Archives, that's the fun thing, because then you start looking for things that you don't think other people have looked for. And then that's why I wanted to put that slide in there, because when you're writing a story, you're covering over all that research. You just want it to be a smooth story. But those sort of hard-won little factoids are a lot of fun too.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, given the prominence of this man, that we see Stuyvesant's name everywhere. Stuyvesant Town, Stuyvesant Place, Stuyvesant High School, innumerable mentions of Stuyvesant. I grew up in New York. Stuyvesant was, kind of second nature to any New York school child. Nicolls was not.
That's interesting because, a lot of people in the world of Dutch studies, which I'm part of, complain about the Dutch part not being so prominent. So it's a funny thing. But yes, Stuyvesant is remembered. Nicolls is not. It's a strange thing because Nicolls became the first governor. He named the city. He is the one who that was New Amsterdam, just the financial district. He said, no, the island of Manhattan is going to be New York. He made a lot of decisions that established the template of New York. And to me, as a writer, that's ideal. You find someone who is quite consequential, but largely unknown. That's, gives you an opportunity.
Well, we'll have to do more celebrating of him now. So, here we are at the tip of Manhattan. What are we looking, when we look south, what are we seeing? We're seeing New Jersey. It seems to me that New Jersey must have had features equally appealing to both the Dutch and to Richard Nicolls and the British. So what's the story of New Jersey?
New Netherland, as I showed in that one slide, encompassed New Jersey originally, as well as parts of Delaware and Pennsylvania. So it was a bigger swath than New York State is. So Nicolls engineers this merger. So he takes it over from the Dutch. And for about 5 minutes, he's exultant. And then he gets, a ship arrives with a message from home saying that his boss, the Duke of York, has decided that he's going to give 2 of his friends a chunk. They supported him during the war, and he's going to give them a vast chunk of his colony. And the one had been the governor of the island of Jersey, so he's going to call that New Jersey. And Nicolls is stunned because he has plans for how to develop this, and you know, he's got this. He wants to make this grow. That land over there is a very important part of it. The land right across the Hudson River is a part of his plans for development, so to speak. So he starts writing this series of letters, which become increasingly kind of strident, to some to York himself and some to others in the government, saying, no, you can't do this. Give them. Then he suggests, give them Delaware. They'll love Delaware. But the decision was made, and I think that's what eventually made Nicolls sort of give up and say, you know what, I'm ready to come back home. Will you please recall me? Because he was so disgusted. So Nicolls named New York after the title of the Duke of York. He was also the Duke of Albany. Nicolls named Albany after him, and he also wanted to name New Jersey Albania. And my little joke here is there are a lot of New Yorkers who still think of New Jersey as Albania. Apologies to any people from New Jersey.
So how might things have been different had he gotten his way with New Jersey?
Yeah, I don't know about you. I have a hard time with questions like, what if, you know, what if...
What if move on to the next question.
But for that matter, what if they had, you know, things had gone differently during this standoff? You know, would we be speaking Dutch here? You know, if history, you know, just changed a little bit. That's why I was attracted to this story, because, you know, these pieces of history that people treat as inevitable. Of course, you know, and that was part of the kind of spin doctoring, that the Dutch didn't know what they were doing there, so the English had to step in and took charge, and then New York really becomes New York. In fact, the Dutch were quite capable of what they were doing, but and it didn't have to go the way it did.
Yeah, on the other hand, I think it's remarkable how much of a presence the Dutch still has. Island at the center of the world, you point out all these words that we still retain, stoop among them. Maybe nobody uses that word anymore, but you know, some of us who are natives here know it well. But the story of Santa Claus, for example, which the New York Historical really owns, but it's a Dutch. You know, I mean, you go through all these remnants of this very short period of time, 40 years of Dutch presence here. So, you know, I think it's from that perspective, it is quite remarkable that we still are as Dutch as we are.
And I think
today.
that has a lot to do with this merger agreement, that everything stayed, the people stayed, and then you get things, so that allows for Dutchness to settle in little ways, like words, like cookies, which is Dutch for little cakes. And we don't say biscuits, we say cookies. And then in the 1760s, I think it is, 1770s, you see in New York newspapers, they are in early December, they're referring to the Feast of Sinterklaas, which the Dutch families are celebrating. And then eventually that gets, the feast day is December 5th. And then that gets translated to, and Sinterklaas becomes Santa Claus and becomes attached to December 25th, to Christmas Day. So, you know, those little ways that, that those inheritances are still manifest. But I think the large way is, the large manifestations are a multi-ethnic society and capitalism. The Dutch pioneered those two things in the 17th century, and that's what Nicolls, without having the word capitalism wouldn't come into being for a couple hundred years, but that's what Nicolls saw functioning, and that's why he wanted to keep it and wanted to keep this, keep these features, and that's how it eventually allows for New York to flourish as it did.
So Richard Nicolls has a very powerful presence at the beginning of your book and at the end of your book, but there are many, many protagonists who come into play in between. You want to talk about some of them? They're very, very interesting, interesting characters, and you draw them out in ways that, really make the reader able to kind of have a visceral feeling for what this story is about.
So it was not just these two leaders who decided what they were doing. There were about 1,500 people in New Amsterdam, and it was really a group effort. People, when they saw that Stuyvesant was, at one point, Stuyvesant's ready to go to war, and he's telling the guys to get their cannons ready, there was this mass outpouring. They did not want that. So Stuyvesant's struggle was between his loyalty to the West India Company and to the home country, and his loyalty to this place and these people. And ultimately, he sides with them. He decides that that's where his loyalty is. So I picked a few of the people from the city of New Amsterdam to elucidate and to help tell the story. One is a woman named Dorothea Angola. She was enslaved. She may have come on the very first shipment of Africans in 1627, right after New Amsterdam was founded. The whole story of slavery in the colony is a complicated one. They were making it up as they went. There were not laws restricting the enslaved. There were not laws, in particular, supporting the slave owners. In 1644, a number of enslaved men petitioned for freedom, because this was part of the understanding, it seemed to be, of what slavery was at that time for them and their wives. And her husband was part of that, so they became freed. He died. She marries another freed African. She then gets land and gets 6 acres of land, becomes a landowner and a presence. And that land was further north than New Amsterdam, and I sort of plotted that, was plotting it on the grid, and it's Sullivan, Thompson, McDougall, Bleecker, and it's like, and I had just seen A Complete Unknown, the Bob Dylan movie, and I was like, wait a second, this is like the terrain of folk singers and freedom, and beneath that is this woman whose story fleshes it out in a different way. So she was part of the community. Catalina Trico, I use her to tell the story. She was, I guess you would call her a peasant, a French-speaking peasant from Europe who came. She was part of the very first shipment. She and her husband, Joris Rapalje, and they came together. They were originally sent up to what became Albany to plant, just putting stakes in the ground. They were really starting from scratch. Then they were recalled to Manhattan, and they became prominent citizens. They had they built a house, and then they built a house next to it, and their daughter lived there with her family. She had 11 children. Each of them lived to have children, so they kind of become the Adam and Eve of New Netherland over time. And I've gotten, when Island Center of the World came out, and I wrote about her then, I've got, I don't know, hundreds of emails from people who say, I'm a descendant of Catalina, because they have a network out there. So that's a couple of the people who I chose to tell parts of the story.
So I have to wonder about some of the unkind references to the Dutch. Maybe the British introduced them. We've got a lot of phrases, going Dutch, Dutch uncle. Yeah. Where did all those things come from?
This whole period of history is, as I said, this rivalry between the English and the Dutch are ahead of them for the most part. And that establishes a great deal of envy. And so this was before newspapers were prominent, and people published pamphlets, and that's how they spread word of what was going on. And most of these phrases come from that period, from these pamphlets. One of the titles of a pamphlet that sticks in my mind is how the Dutch were bred from a horse turd kept in a butter box. You know, so you just see all this like weird anger coming out. And so things like going Dutch, you know, why are they so wealthy suddenly, this little nation? You know, they must be cheap, and they must be, you know, and then Dutch courage, which, you know, these people don't like to talk to, you know, our kids, and they don't even know these terms anymore. But Dutch courage meant in order to get up your nerve to do something, you had to get drunk. So they're all derogatory terms that come from that period, from England.
Okay, so let's turn to some audience questions. Can you compare Dutch Native American relations to those that the British had with Native peoples?
The whole story of relations with the natives is, of course, overall a fraught one. It's also really complicated because the Dutch were here to do business with them. They were not here to fight with them and displace them. They were here to, the Europeans did not trap furs. The native people trapped furs, and they traded with them. And the native people wanted European manufactured goods. And that was the system that they set up. And it was, in a way, kind of an ideal system because both sides had something the other wanted. And it lasted until it didn't. And then fighting would break out, caused by, you know, and each case, you know, the Peach War, so-called, was because a native took peaches from somebody's tree. Is that really what caused it? I don't know. But each of these outbreaks leads to bloodshed, and then there's a treaty, and they come, and then business picks up from there. Beneath all of that is this business of buying out the land and dispossessing them. And the Dutch executed something like 600 deeds of land with native people in this 40-year period. And initially, it was they understood the native understanding, that the native people did not have a concept of real estate, that this would be more like, okay, we'll allow you to continue to live here as well, but we'll stay here, and we'll, if one of us is attacked, the other will come to your aid. But then the Dutch quickly decide, no, I've got a title to this land, so get out. So that once they start to get more powerful, they push them out. And then you see several instances in which a native leader signs an agreement, moves a little bit to the west with his people, and then signs another one and moves less. And you can just see them being pushed out. So that's obviously the larger story under the English and under the Dutch.
So things didn't radically change under the British?
Radically change, I would say not. Nicolls picked up on several treaties that Stuyvesant had negotiated, and then went himself to, and would bring Dutch emissaries with him to the native people to say, okay, we're now the ones for you to deal with. So I think it was more continuity than a radical change.
So, you know, around that same time that you were launching Island at the Center of the World, we were launching an exhibition on slavery in New York.
Yeah.
And certainly we argued in that exhibition that things did radically change for enslaved people in New York when it became New York.
Yes, but so it was, as I said, an ad hoc affair under the Dutch, and there were no enslaved people, no large shipments from Africa to the Dutch colony until 2 weeks before Richard Nicolls showed up. The first shipment of 290 men, women, and children from Africa that Stuyvesant had engineered arrives in the harbor. So when Nicolls gets there, there's this ship there, and there's all these newly arrived Africans kind of stumbling around trying to figure out what is this, and now there's this. So that's something Stuyvesant, it was really bad timing for him in that regard too, because he's got to deal with the English, he's got to figure out how to house and feed these people. So I would say slavery began ramping up under the Dutch at the very end. Mm-hmm. And then Nicolls and others began to took it from there. My colleague Dennis Micah is writing a book now in which he really elucidates ways in which that happened, and he says that it was really there was a continuity of these traders. They were allowed to stay, Dutch or wherever they were from originally, and they had started this network of incorporating human beings into their portfolio, so to speak, and that then continued under the English.
Okay, so this question goes back to what happened with this takeover or merger. Did the Dutch who remained, and the Dutch pretty much remained, right? There was no reason for the Dutch to flee after the English arrived. Did they retain their Dutch citizenship?
Did they retain their Dutch citizenship? Citizenship was not the thing that it is now. And there's this interesting, I think that the prime case in this regard is Stuyvesant himself, who has to go back after he gives up the colony and is on trial for doing so. And he has to defend himself. He brings a whole crate of documents and so on. Eventually, he's exonerated. And then the most telling thing about him is he decides to return to New York and lives out his days in what's now the East Village and Stuyvesant Town. And so truly was a New Yorker and an American. So citizenship, I mean, it's more like, who am I? Where's home? What are my roots? And they, because of this agreement, the Dutch and this mixed community felt that this was their home, and that's why they had agreed to this merger agreement.
Yeah, so if they felt they were citizens of any place, it was New Amsterdam or New York.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. And initially, when the takeover happened, it set off the Second Anglo-Dutch War, and when you had these trade wars, everybody, the typical thing was, okay, in a couple of years, negotiators are going to sit down and they're going to say, all right, give everything back. So they expected that. The Dutch expected, okay, I'm just going to hold my breath for a while and then it'll. But in this case, there's a Latin term, which I can't remember, but it basically means keep everything as is. And that went into effect. So the English kept New York. And there is a letter from a Dutchman writing home saying, well, I guess now we're going to have to learn English.
So that's a great segue into two questions about names. One of them is, okay, the British renamed New Amsterdam. What happened to Brooklyn?
A lot of
Brooklyn
Dutch names
Brooklyn.
stayed the same. Brooklyn stayed Brooklyn. And Staten Island was Staten Island, named for the States General, the Dutch governing body. So there are a lot of place names remained. And how that happens is its own, I mean, those kind of folk stories of how places get a name and keep a name and when it gets changed, that's complicated.
And another question about names is any remnants of the African population? Any names that we recognize or words that we recognize today?
I cannot think, that's a tough question. I cannot think of anything. What I showed you on that slide that we had in the exhibit, all those, that collection of artifacts, that is a remarkable thing because it's a very particular manifestation of a certain kind of West Central African culture. And it was found outside the home of Cornelis van Tienhoven, who was Stuyvesant's right-hand man, buried just below the ground. And there was a plate, like a Dutch plate, on top of it. And what you would do is take off the plate, and the person who was like the healer would take a drink of alcohol, like brandy or something, typically on like a weekly basis, and spray this collection of objects to keep it animated. And this is for healing of an individual or a town. So that's a very rare evidence of African culture but that lay buried forever. So it's very hard to find that.
Okay, so we were talking actually with Michael Weisberg just before we came on the stage about how most colonies in what would become the United States were founded on the grounds of finding religious freedom, not for everyone, but for whatever that religious group was that founded the colony. We were thinking that maybe New Amsterdam was unique in that sense, or New Netherlands more generally was unique in that sense, that it was not founded for the purpose of finding religious freedom for any single group.
There's a complicated answer to that, which I won't go into, but the West India Company had a number of directors. Some of them were very religious, and they wanted these outposts to be sort of missionary outposts. So there was that kind of push there. But by and large, it was founded as a money-making enterprise, and that was their model was what the East India Company had done in the East Indies, that is to say Asia, where they had gotten people in what is now Indonesia in particular. They had set up trade routes and in order to get these very valuable spices and other commodities, and that brought fantastic wealth to the home country. So they said, oh, we'll do the same thing in the West Indies, that is North America, Caribbean, South America. It didn't turn out that way for a variety of reasons, but it had been, yeah. It was a money-making enterprise, supposedly. The West India Company was the overlord, and Peter Stuyvesant, in his 17 years, what he came to see was the only way it would really last and succeed as a colony was if the freelance traders, who were not officially part of the West India Company, firms in Amsterdam would send one of their sons to New Amsterdam to open a branch office. And so what he recognized was they had to flourish within this system. So he realized that he refashioned his position so that he was a middleman between the West India Company and these freelance traders, and set up this really novel arrangement. So the larger company provided protection, but they could flourish as traders. And that essentially is what Richard Nicolls was attracted to.
Just time for a couple more questions. One of them is, did the British bring, in those early years, any kind of defining infrastructure like windmills, or develop the canals? Or
you mean did the Dutch or did
the British? When the British came, did
the British bring windmills? I don't
not
think
windmills.
So.
The Dutch had windmills.
Yeah.
Did the British make any infrastructure improvements?
Sure.
I should say?
They started right away. There were a lot of. One of the main problems of New Amsterdam was there wasn't a source of fresh water. So Nicolls was like, okay, we're gonna. He tried several different means of digging wells and bringing water from other places. So establishing that, roads were unpaved. They began paving roads. You begin to see the development from what looked like kind of a Wild West town into something that's more. I mean, he was only here 4 years, Nicolls. So it was quite limited, and he was dealing with the Puritans the whole time and all that. But you begin to see the town modernizing, so to speak.
So finally, and I know this is right up your alley, where we've been commemorating 400 years since the Dutch first landed on our shores over the last couple of years, and I guess over the last year, and we'll be doing so for another year. New York is a tough place right now. What parts of Dutch culture, and maybe you can expand into early British culture, that was brought to the city could help us right now?
Well, I think overall, the lesson that I found that was quite remarkable in this story is that you had these two enemies. They were enemies in Europe. They had recently fought a war. And Nicolls came armed to the teeth to fight. And they took the time to figure each other out and to do what you're supposed to do in negotiations, like what do I need to get out of this? What does the other side need to get out of it so that they can function? And they hashed something out. And that, I think, is that awareness of the humanity of the other, and that we both need to get something out of this, and how can we make that happen, is something that I think is sorely needed in New York and elsewhere right now.
Right. I would make a much more general statement about that need. Just to let everyone know, I know many of you surely did see and enjoy and learn from the wonderful exhibition that Russell did last year, New York Before New York. Russell is curating another exhibition for 2026, which is going to be eye-popping because of its Dutch masters, old Dutch masters, that that will be included in the show. Many of them never have been on view in New York before. And his argument will be in that show that we can learn a lot about what New Amsterdam was like from old masters, old Dutch masters. So something to look forward to late in 2026 will be part of our commemorations of 400 years, but also of the 250th. So,
and part of the new New York Historical.
And it will be part of the new New York Historical as we launch our new Tang Wing for American Democracy. On that note, I thank all of you for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Russell.
Thank you. Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kat. Okay. Okay. Down here or?
Just that.